Why do high performers get trapped in anxiety, stress about the future, and self-doubt when they've clearly had so much success up to this point? Why is it that someone can be so good at what they do and such a light for others, yet still reach the point of burnout where they don't even want to show up anymore? And when they do, they subtly sabotage their own success. These are topics that we're going to be discussing today on our episode of Conquer the Day. Now, there's no better expert that I would prefer to bring in to discuss these topics than Luke Parker. Luke Parker is joining us today, and he is one of Tony Robbins' master coaches, which means that the Robbins Research team has hand-selected him to serve their top clientele. And these are leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs all across the globe that Luke works with one-on-one to help them become unstoppable. Now, today, you can look forward to hearing about topics like servant leadership and purpose-driven success, how prioritizing relationships fuels success rather than competing with it, how to manage your energy, which many times it's far more important than how to manage your time, and faith, how you can integrate faith to actually provide yourself more strength and mental clarity and resilience in times of stress in a way that really resonates with you. And on a personal level, I'm also so excited to bring Luke in because for the last 5 to 6 months, Luke has been my performance coach as well. And I can honestly say that I have not experienced such quick, effective growth in this period of time ever in my life. He and I have been working together for, as I said, not even 6 months. And I have grown exponentially in my mindset, how I process stress, and just in the way that I'm leading and showing up, both for myself and for others. So I'm so looking forward to you hearing this conversation, especially if you are in a leadership position and you are in a space where you can feel yourself butting up against the ceiling. You're starting to burn out. You're getting overwhelmed. You feel like there's not enough of you to go around. This is the perfect episode for you to be listening to if you're at that point or you can feel yourself reaching it. So tune in, turn it on, and get ready to learn from Luke, Brian, and myself on today's episode of Conquer the Day. Luke, thank you for being here with us again. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real honor and pleasure. And so as we start off, Luke, what we really want to do is kind of go back to more of your beginnings before you got into coaching. What got you into this coaching model where you started to support others? Like, what was your business experience, your work experience that made it so you were passionate about helping others navigate their way to performance and growth as well?
Absolutely. So my background is actually not in psychology. If you follow Tony Robbins at all, you know that he's big on psychology. For me, the psychology actually came much later. Where I started was in business. And I'm a puzzle guy. Before we started the recording, we were briefly talking about chess. I'm a chess guy. I love strategy. I love puzzles. I love solving patterns. And so business made sense to me. And so I got my start in business development. And all of the businesses that I developed and helped develop are still going today, some of them more successful than others. And I've been able to transition to hands-off for the most part in them. But what got me into coaching was actually not my success. It was actually what I considered for a long time to be a failure, which was what I lovingly refer to as business number 6, which was a production company. So to not get too deep into the story, I'm from the United States. I moved to Mexico 10 years ago, and I again had this background in business, but it was all brick and mortar business. And for legal reasons, I couldn't do brick and mortar business in Mexico when I first moved here. So I said, okay, I know business. Brick and mortar is the same as digital. I'm a techie guy, so I can make this work. I applied all the principles, and I was super, super ridiculously unfulfilled. And so I didn't know why. I was following all the same patterns. I knew it wasn't a business problem. I was making the money, and yet I wasn't the man that I was proud to be, the man I wanted to be when I went home to be with my family at the end of the day. And for me, we'll talk about this later when we talk about relationships, but for me, my family's my why. And so when I'm out of alignment and I'm not serving my family, it doesn't matter how successful I am, how much money I'm making, that's a crippling thing to face. So what I found when I entered the Tony world was I went to Business Mastery. I got a coach. She's actually still my coach, business trainer. I know you guys have been through that business training as well. Phenomenal content. And so we went through that from a business perspective. And one day, my who's now my coach, she was the trainer at the time, she pulled me aside and she said, Luke, can we talk? And I'd known her for a year at this point. So I said, sure, what's up? She said, Luke, I don't think you're okay. And I didn't know how to handle that because my whole identity was what I described before. It was about success. It was about solving problems. It was about fixing things and growing things and being successful. And she said, Luke, I don't think you're okay. And we ended up talking less about business, more about personal stuff. And what we found, to cut a long story short, is that I was absolutely and completely out of alignment. And I was burnt out. So we talk about burnout. For me, in my own personal experience and the work I do with clients, what I've found as the pattern of burnout isn't from working too much. It's from the work you're doing and the mission you're serving being in some way out of alignment. Now, if you had told me back then that I was out of alignment, I would have said, no, that can't be. I'm serving people. That's what I'm here to do. I'm here to help people. And I was. And yet, to get a little more granular, the way I was serving people was by creating digital content. So I was a technician, I was editing videos, and I was creating courses and helping entrepreneurs scale their brand and dominate a market space. And I was good at it, and it was working, and yet I was missing something. I said, but I was helping people in brick and mortar, and I loved it. I'm helping people now, and I hate it. And so that's when my coach helped me understand that, and the distinction that specifically led me to falling in love with coaching, not just training, not just information, was when she helped me realize I needed what I now call the exchange. And the exchange is, Lindsay can tell you this, we do this at the beginning and end of every call. The exchange is, you start out a call by saying, hey, what's great in life? We're about to talk about problems for 28 minutes. Let's spend the first 1 minute talking about what's great. And that charges me up. It's that connection, the human connection. And at the end of the call, we end with the question that, Lindsay, you might not have been with me long enough to get tired of this question yet, but give it a couple of years. And the question is, what was your greatest value from your coaching call today? And so we're starting on a celebration, we're ending on a celebration, and we're celebrating how in the last 30 minutes of both of our lives, I just made your life better. And no, it's not about me. And I, at times, said, I wrestled with that, and I said, no, I'm not supposed to make it about me. No, it's about you. And really, my coach gave me permission for me to benefit from that as well. And it was kind of like, a car driving up to a gas pump and not opening up the gas cap. And my coach gave me permission to make that 2 millimeter shift to unlock the gas cap and let that exchange, let that social dynamic, that celebration fill me up. And so what that's allowed me to do is, instead of needing to take massive breaks in between client engagements, I get to coach back to back most of the time. And that would not at all be possible if it weren't for that one distinction that I got before I even became a coach.
Yeah. Well, what is interesting too about that is, so obviously the arc of your story is one that led you to the point where you realized there was that exchange of value back to alignment. But I wanted to point this out because someone might hear what you just said and say, well, that's really great about Luke, but what the hell does that actually mean for me? But even some nugget in there is seeing the value and starting with something that's grounded in what's positive and then ending with an insight or takeaway. I think that one of the things that we've seen with a lot of our clients that we're coaching is they start showing up in meetings starting that way, right? Instead of just say, hey, what problem are we solving? What are we working on today? And then, okay, go do it. It's like, no, hey, what was actually going really well? And then what did we gain from this meeting? What did we gain from our time here versus the mundane strategy of go and execute the thing and let's come back when there's another problem? Because if that's the way that you're running, you're always going to be focusing on another problem. And there's never that feedback loop of growth or productivity in a positive direction. So
it's give and receive is that higher level experience, because you can only give for so long. You can only exhale for so long before you need to inhale.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I think that's a blind spot, is people undervalue what it actually means to receive, or they don't know how to receive. Like I know Brian's talked about in years past, like, oh, I receive compliments, but I don't feel it. Like I don't receive it. And it's kind of isn't an art in a way, because it's more of a, what I gather from what you're saying is it's more of a soul experience. It's not transactional, even though it's give, receive. It's like, it can't be just a check of a box. Like, oh yeah, thank you for that compliment, or thank you for saying that was valuable today. Like, you have to actually receive it. But I don't know if that's kind of summarizes what you're saying, but that's what I hear.
Absolutely. And to make it a higher level chunk that applies to more people, my burnout didn't come because I was lacking feedback. The burnout came because I wasn't aligned with me. And so we'll talk a little bit later about the faith piece and how there's purpose. And for me, discovering parts of myself, things about me that I didn't know before, allowed me to then solve a bigger puzzle, not just the external business strategy puzzle, but now the internal puzzle of, okay, how do I accomplish this mission and enjoy the process?
Best question. My favorite question. So let's go that way a little bit more, because it sounds like there was a blind spot for you. And I know one of the things that we really want to hit on is blind spots. They're blind spots for a reason. It means you can't see them. I think it's something that I say to clients a lot, and they're like, yeah, you're right. And it's like, no, you don't understand. It's a blind spot because you can't see it. So we need to show you it and make it much more obvious. You need to look at it and recognize it. So from your experience, what was the blind spot then for you? Like, when you say it's alignment, what was the blind spot? And then maybe that can lead us into what are some other common blind spots that you now see in other people. But what was that blind spot for you?
Yeah, I would say the blind spot, later maybe we'll talk about how problems exist inside of a box. And we'll talk about what that means, but my box was that it was a definition of success. And success means I have money coming in, the numbers are going up, and that should feel good. That was my box. And then I was inputting my life circumstances into that math equation, and the math wasn't mathing. And so I should have been happy at the end of the day, and I wasn't. And so in order to get out of that, I needed to expand my box, which in this case meant expanding my definition of what is success. And it's not happiness instead of financial success. It's yes and. Let's get the finances going really well, and let's make sure we're serving people. Yes, let's make sure we're serving people, and let's make sure that we're having fun in the process. And to put a punctuation on it, I literally used to say all the time, when people would say, "What do you want?" It's a classic Tony question, "What do you want?" I would get upset and I would say, "Don't ask me what I want. Ask me what we're going to do to get the outcome." So I was so outcome focused. I was so driven to achieve and succeed and get the thing done. And it just got to a point where I was like, well, what more? Like, is more gonna fix this? No, more didn't fix it. And I was cranking that dial of working so hard and getting more clients and doing more things and charging more money, and it wasn't giving me what I really wanted. And so I needed to expand the box to say, well, no, what if it's not about happiness or finances? What if happiness comes when you're actively pursuing what you're put here to do, and you're doing that in a way that lights you up? And what if in the process of doing that and loving and enjoying the process, what if abundant finances get to just flow your way because you're serving and you're living in alignment with your purpose and your calling?
Yeah, love it.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too, because when you zoom out, you start to realize that you can make money doing anything. There's an abundant way of making money, and it doesn't necessarily have to even be your job, right? Your job can be the means that gets you the finances to go and create another venture. But I think that sometimes people are so blocked by fear, and maybe it's not fear. Luke, is there better articulation that you might have pinned down in your practice or in the work that you've done that has shown you that maybe it's not fear, maybe it's something else, maybe there's some other mechanism that keeps people from seeing the opportunity even though they despise what they're doing? What keeps people stuck in that pattern?
Great question. So there's a couple questions there. One is it fear? So fear is, of course, one experience. And if we're talking to high achievers and entrepreneurs and CEOs, a lot of people would say, I'm not afraid. What are you talking about? So what I would word it as is a lot of entrepreneurs, in my experience, get caught in an obsession with certainty and specifically about the future. And they're asking the question, how can I guarantee that this will work? Will it work? Will it work? Will it work? And sometimes you'll be coaching or consulting with somebody, and I don't know if you've ever tried to give somebody advice, and you can tell that they're calculating, they're trying to predict the future. Will it work? You could have the best business strategy and then get hit by a meteor tomorrow. Did the business strategy work? It's an invalid question, right? Because so when we try to predict the future, we try to reach out into the future and we choose one of two things. We either choose a good vision of the future, that's an expectation, and we pull that back and say, oh, I'm sure it's going to work. That would be uninformed optimism. Or we reach out into the future and we pull in a negative experience, a painful thing that says, oh, I'm sure it's not going to work. Well, the reason we do both of those things is to give us certainty in some way, to help us be more confident, more certain of, you could say, our own survival. And so we need to change that question from will it work to instead of certainty questions, we want to ask probability questions. How can I maximize the likelihood of achieving this outcome? And then the one thing I would tack on to that is sometimes people, when I share this with my clients, sometimes somebody will go and execute and they'll make a really good guess as to what should work. And it works mostly, and then they get feedback, but sometimes they can be really frustrated that that one thing wasn't the thing that fixed all their problems. But that's not how entrepreneurship works. You make a really good guess based on the information you have today, you execute at the highest possible level, you get feedback, and then you adapt and iterate. And so it's not one time that you ask, how can I maximize the likelihood? It's over and over and over again. What did we learn? Great. How do we implement? Great. How do we optimize? And so I would say that's trap number one, is an obsession with certainty, trying to pull certainty from the future. There is no certainty about the future. None of us know whether we're waking up tomorrow or not, and that can't cripple our action today.
And what you said there was really important, because it's the desire to stay alive, right? It's, as we said, it's a survival mechanism. But you also alluded to it at the beginning when you were talking about your identity. It's also the desire to stay alive or stay in survival with our core identity, right? So if someone has achieved a moderate level of success, there's status, there's the relational way that they are, and they want to keep that, right? And my guess is that would come up too, right? It's how do I make sure that I stay in my box of success? And in order to do that, go to the next level, you have to be willing to let go of that certainty. Is that pretty accurate?
I couldn't agree more. And I would say it this way, that most entrepreneurs, most people at the level of success that I understand your audience is at, have been rewarded for high levels of competence. Yeah. Now, that's not the case for all quote unquote entrepreneurs. You can have solopreneurs who are just trying stuff and they don't actually get to the first level of success. I don't think that's who's listening to this podcast. I think the people that are listening are people who have learned and been rewarded for cranking the dial of personal productivity. That they've learned how to do the thing and do it really well. And because we've been rewarded for that, we want to keep cranking that dial. But if you've ever read or heard of the book 10x is easier than 2x, it really is another great example of expanding the box. And it's another example of this concept, is that when an entrepreneur who's been rewarded for operating their business keeps trying to get more incremental gains by getting more and more productive themselves, there is a human limit to how much they're capable of achieving in terms of scale. And so what I would say is, if you have the belief that, oh, I have to do it all myself, and I think this comes in two archetypes of entrepreneurs. One would be the solopreneur or close to solopreneur that is literally just doing the whole thing themselves. And with AI today, you can scale pretty far just doing it yourself. And there's a certain point where you need people, but then there's a second type of entrepreneur who hires people so that they can delegate. They
Yes.
hire people so they can extract the resource of your time, OPT, right? Other people's time. And so they see it as, I need to get my worker bees in line so that they can do what I tell them to do, so that the math equation will make sense at a higher scale of numbers. And what I've found, and what I believe to be true, is that if somebody's in either of those situations and their desire is to scale, they need to expand the box outside of personal productivity, and they need to expand it to leadership. And the way I see it is, leadership is the skill of scale. If you want to scale past a certain point, you need to get really good at first leading yourself so that you don't get your own ego in there, and then leading people. And we'll talk more about what I mean by leading people when we maybe later today. But when I say leading people, it's not, how do I give you a rule book and force you to follow it? It's, how do I call out the greatness in you and align you with our mutual vision and purpose? And then how do I pour into you so you can now multiply that toward the execution of our vision? And so I would say that if you're finding yourself stuck in the trap of having to do it yourself, and like you were talking about with that old identity of, but this is how I was rewarded in the past, a lot of people think that the real job is doing. And that's not the job. It's not about doing. It's not about who's doing. It's about designing a system of people and processes that run without you. And I think sometimes people build the business around themselves. And if you've built the business around yourself, it is doomed ultimately to hit a ceiling. And a fun way of saying this is, if you're the bottleneck, you're also the ceiling. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be the bottleneck, and I don't want to be the ceiling of my business. I want it to scale past me. So that requires leadership.
Yeah. So what occurs to me is that first theme I mentioned around this episode, this conversation is about expansion. So obviously, if you're your bottleneck and your ceiling, then you either stay there or you expand. You go outside of your box, outside of your bottle, go to another level. What do you see in people are the things that they have to let go of or shift in order to do that? Like, especially, we could relate it to work specifically, since that's what we're talking about, but what has to change in order for that pattern to break?
A lot of times people see what they want as mutually exclusive or in opposition to what they have. And they can't let go of what they have because they think they have to give up what they have. And an example of that is what I was just talking about personal productivity and the rewards that come with that, and exchanging that for leadership. Well, but we like getting rewarded. So you might think you have to give up productivity, but again, I know that I'm using this term a lot without having actually explained it. But we have to expand the box. So instead of the box being, how do I get the outcome, we just open it up a little bit and say, how do we get the outcome? And then instead of how do I get rewarded and look good, it's how do we fulfill the mission and purpose? So you're still getting your maybe less sophisticated, less developed, lower level outcomes. You're not giving up those things. An example that Brian mentioned earlier was about the identity and maybe even the ego. And what's fascinating is, at least in my experience, there is no greater fulfillment of ego than putting the ego to the side in service to that mission and cause. And it doesn't mean serving instead of taking care of yourself. It becomes taking care of yourself so you can serve. And so it's about expansion. I love that word, expansion of the box, expansion of your model of the world. It's not about giving up what you want. It's about expanding the definition of what's possible.
And if someone hears, okay, the box, because you haven't given a definition, right?
What's the box?
Well,
What's the box?
Well, it's values, right? It's the expansion of what you value. It's the expansion of your vision. It's the expansion of the good that you can actually do. It's expanding your view. At least that's what I'm hearing. Is that accurate, architect? There's different definitions that fit within our frame of reference, and we have to expand that.
You just said it, frame of reference. That's the box. Yeah. And so the theory behind this is that all problems exist within a box. And if you expand the box far enough, the problem disappears.
Yes.
And what does that mean? an example of this that might not land with everybody, and that's okay, but it's a fun example is, one of the most common questions that clients ask, one of the most common fears that we have as human beings is that we won't be enough. And if we're not enough, we won't be loved. Because if you go back to the survival thing, if you're not loved, you're ostracized, you're rejected, you're kicked out, and ultimately you die, right? So we often find ourselves asking the question, am I good enough? And an example of expanding the box is, what if good enough wasn't a thing? What if there's no such thing as good enough? What if it doesn't exist? Now, we're not going too deep into busting that belief. That would take more time than we have today and wouldn't necessarily hit everybody, but it's an example of generally using questions. Questions expand our thinking. Questions call us out of certainty because an unanswered question is uncertainty. We have to make sure we calibrate those questions to be correct for our current box so that it calls us just outside of it. But if it's a question that's too far outside the box, like maybe what I just shared for some of your listeners was too far outside, and they might have rejected it and said, no, that's hooey. I don't like that. That's dumb. And that's totally okay. And when I'm working with somebody one-on-one, what I do is we calibrate the limits of the box, and then I use language and questions to invite you to explore just a little bit outside the box, ultimately allowing you and your subconscious to realize it is safe outside the box. The box doesn't keep you safe. It's actually restricting you from getting what you want. And so by using those questions, we can expand our frame of reference and our understanding, our model of the world. And that ultimately allows us to ask better questions, higher questions. And what Tony says is that questions are the answer. But again, if the question needed to solve your problem is, say, 5 feet outside the box, we can't start 5 feet outside the box. We have to go 2 inches outside the box. We expand the box. 2 more inches, expand the box. 2 more inches, expand the box. And ultimately, that 5-foot difference has now become inside the box. And that's your next question, and your problem is solved.
But Luke, I just want to know what I need to do in order to be successful. Like, why can't you just tell me what I need to do, right? Isn't that what most people might think, right?
Of course.
And so how do you actually speak to that person who hears this, which is incredibly valuable, right? It's because you're changing your thinking. You're changing your thinking about the problem. What's the difference to the action taker, the person who's like, I just need to take action, just tell me what actions I need to take. I want to stay in the box. And they haven't maybe had that insight. If they're in that spot, but they're also feeling pain, is it that they have to feel more pain in order for them to recognize that the thinking is broken? Or is that maybe they just need to continue to see that there's something better on the other side?
Great question. So you mentioned pain. Pain is unfortunately the universal motivator. So if you don't want to experience high levels of pain, then find another way to motivate yourself to expand the box so you can solve your problems at a higher level. What's fascinating is, I don't know if you ever come to somebody and ask them for advice, and they give you advice, and then, number one, you didn't do it. All right, so maybe the advice was bad. Maybe it was exactly what you needed to solve the problem, and you didn't execute on it because your mindset, your psychology wasn't sufficiently expanded to fit their solution. That's number one. Number two is, sometimes you put yourself in an extreme state of need where not everybody responds to this. This is not a strategy. You put yourself in such an extreme need. Think of how a procrastinator will give themselves an impossible deadline and then they'll achieve more than ever before. Well, they've temporarily expanded the box, but what's the immediate following response of that procrastinator? What do they do right after the deadline's over? Do they maintain that size of the box, or do they immediately shrink down to where they were before, or sometimes even more closed? And when we keep trying to crank that lever of kind of almost traumatizing ourselves to be productive, there's a certain level where you torch your system and you say go and you just don't go. So it's not sustainable.
Yeah. Well, then in that sense too, because I imagine for some people, the reward is not rewarding, right? The thing that you thought would come, which is more success if you push that way, you start to get feedback about what it feels like on the come down. And that also creates that feedback loop of like, yeah, I just can't keep doing this.
With that particular procrastination example, I feel like that when it's a bigger scale, it can be really hard to change that pattern. I know that's one that we've worked on consistently is a long-term idea of procrastination, but it's like, okay, yeah, we had an event that we had 6 months to plan for. We planned it the last month. Okay, we shouldn't do that again. But then it's like still so far away. It's like, oh, well, okay, the next one, and the next one's 6 months out. All right, we'll start that this month. We'll start that this month. Okay, we got 3 weeks. We'll at least be better. We'll do 6 weeks out. And then you're continuing to try to break the pattern of procrastinating it. So I guess when you have experienced that, how do you pull that pain closer to you? Or as you said, maybe don't wait for so much pain. How do you expand the box? When you're trying to break a pattern that's not immediately painful and the pain takes a lot longer to set in, what are the ways that you can maybe speed up that growth or like break through it faster other than, again, like, oh, just do it. Just do it sooner. Just schedule it. Just like do all the things that
Anytime you
achievers
find
do.
yourself telling yourself to just do something, this isn't part of your question. And I think a lot of us find ourselves judging ourselves. We look at ourselves as we are, and maybe we're nice people. We have unconditional positive regard for others, and yet we don't have that same thing for ourselves. And that judgment actually prevents us from influencing ourselves. I mentioned earlier self-leadership. So the first person we need to lead is ourselves. And procrastination is ineffective self-leadership. That's all it is.
Sure.
And so we mentioned the motivator of pain, to now come back to your original question. We mentioned the motivator of pain. Pain is sometimes the most attractive motivator because it's the one that always works. If you can create enough pain, I guarantee change. The metaphor I give people is, if you're hanging off a burning building, a piece of metal, and you're hanging over an endless abyss, and you'll die when you hit the bottom, this is the only thing that's allowing you to stay alive. But if I start heating up that metal piece until it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, there's a certain point where certain death after you fall is less painful than the absolutely certain pain that you're experiencing, and you will let go. Now, that's a very violent way to accomplish change, but it does work. I personally, if you've ever read Power versus Force, if you haven't, highly recommend it. But force is in general using pain, and force creates an equal and opposite counterforce.
Yeah.
Anytime you're communicating and you're threatening somebody, they will respond by either kind of getting their hackles up and fighting back, or they'll cower and they'll shut down. But either way, you don't get your outcome. And the only way to force someone to comply, including yourself, is to be stronger than them. So all you have to do is be stronger than yourself. That's the strategy. No, you can't. So ultimately, you can temporarily hurt yourself into taking action. That's what pain motivation, that's what deadlines, there's lots of different ways of accomplishing that. There is a time and place for that. And especially when somebody is first starting a coaching relationship, I will absolutely have a conversation with them, and I will say, look, we need to get your outcomes faster than you're able to get the personal transformation that you need. We're going to use a temporary strategy. And I'll give you a silly example. I had a guy come work with me, and his whole thing was he didn't like this certain friend, right? They were kind of enemies. And I said, okay, so you came to your second coaching call and you didn't do your homework. What did you learn? And his learning wasn't sufficiently convincing that I thought he was going to do it differently next time. And I said, okay, you have a deadline. This is really important for you to accomplish. So I started thinking, okay, how do we create pain associated with not doing your homework? And all we did was I said, that favorite pair of shoes that you want to buy, I want you to commit to me on this call that if you don't do your homework next time, you have to buy those shoes for the person you don't like. That just happened to be painful enough for him that he's never missed his homework since then. And now we laugh about it because now he's outside of needing pain. He's in momentum. And you mentioned something earlier. You said, so we're talking about pain. You mentioned something earlier. You said that sometimes the pattern isn't immediately painful enough. And that's kind of the key piece. So there's 3 types of people. anybody on listening to this is in one of these three camps. Either they are in desperation, which is where they are so in pain that they must change. It's the easiest person to influence change for. They're just thirsty for change. You give them anything and they'll just do it. Not everybody's like that. The problem with that pain motivation as well is that if you guys are in fitness, so you know that if somebody comes to you because they're deeply shameful about their body because they've gained too much weight, there's a certain point, tell me if you haven't noticed this, where they're no longer so fat that they feel crippling shame. And so now they start losing progress because what previously pushed them isn't as strong anymore. And so if we don't transition into the second type, then ultimately we will unfortunately fall into the third. So let me tell you what the second type is. The second type, first is desperation. The second is inspiration. Inspiration is where you guys are at. It's where I'm at. It's where things are awesome. And I'm asking the question, how much better can it possibly get? This is awesome. And that's the realm of pleasure motivation. So we have two motivators, pain and pleasure. Desperation, you're crippled by the pain and you need to get out of the pain. It's urgent. And so I take action. So Brian, to answer your question, when somebody says, but just give me the strategy. All right, if you really need to get yourself to do something, make it painful not to, and you will do it. And that's a short-term solution, not a long-term solution. I mentioned there's a third type. If we don't transition our clients, if we don't transition ourselves from desperation to inspiration, which is that celebration, what was your greatest value from your coaching call? That's inspiration. Let's keep the pleasure. Let's keep the reward. Let's keep going. In the middle of those two is stagnation. And that's the person that Lindsay described when she said, sometimes the problem isn't painful enough to change. It's not good, but it's not that bad. Yeah. And so unfortunately, most of the time, if you find yourself in that place, that's where you really need to use a little bit of that pain leverage to say, look, you got to snap yourself out of this, because if it's not working now and you don't change something, it's not going to change later. Better to change now with the pain of leverage than the pain of regret that you can't change. So let's shake some things up. That's where the value of signing up for something like a personal trainer can help you, right? The personal trainer kind of pushes you a little bit, says, come on, hey, come on, you can, let's go, let's do this. You can do this. Come on. They add a little bit of pressure, which is a form of pain, but we like it because then we get rewarded with progress. So those three types of people will determine the strategy that you use. If you're in desperation, you really just need the way out. You need a helping hand. Maybe you need the strategy, the information, or the whatever it might be. Your box is just waiting to burst open. It's awesome. If you're in stagnation, you might find that you'd benefit from cranking up the pain just a little bit.
Yep, that makes perfect sense, because whenever somebody's going through the process of committing to themselves, and whether they're working with us or I'm sure it's the same with you, our aim is not to take them into desperation and let them just experience that and then say, okay, we can help, here you go. Like, it's to take them in a conversation from desperation to inspiration, to then you want to commit from a place of, and I believe it can be better, versus I'm so in pain that I need to at least do something. It's like those people can absolutely make the transformation, but if we can speed that process up through a conversation or a coaching session, it's a much more pleasant experience too. So, I mean, even to reflect it back to myself, it doesn't have to take more than an hour of talk about the benefits and the cost to be able to make that shift from complacency into inspiration. So that makes perfect sense.
For someone to be able to change, they need enough pain with the way things are to get them into motion, but then they need belief that what's on the other side of this change is better than what they have now. That's the inspiration piece. Some people will use only pain, and then that just tortures your system. You need for me, pain is what starts the car. Pleasure is what gets you, it's the gas in the tank that gets you to your destination.
Yeah, one of the things that I've discovered, and I can't remember where I heard this, but whatever emotion is used to get us into motion often needs to be revisited to keep us there, right? So if someone is using shame as their ultimate trigger, they hit that point where they get complacent again and they start to slide. And so there needs to be that transition, like you're saying, a transition from this is something that is moving me, and then I need to be able to flip it.
Yeah.
I wanted to pivot back because we talked a lot about, obviously this is a conversation that we believe will lead to insights about someone who's feeling stuck or feeling burnt out. Maybe they're starting to have some insights about the reasons why they're feeling the way they're feeling. But once we make that decision to change and we do own ourselves and we do become that leader of ourselves, how do we take that and shift from being a leader of ourselves to helping others find more growth as well? How do we become that servant leader? What does that really mean?
Great question. So, as I said before, a servant leader, the way I define it, these are just my words, but my way of defining servant leader is somebody who pours into others. You could call that empowering them, equipping them, training them, whatever that would look like. But we pour into others, and then that pouring into creates a multiplicative and expanding effect, and that's scale. And so, in order for me to pour out into others, I need to first fill up. And we haven't talked about faith yet, but faith is one of the ways that I fill up. Another way that I fill up is by taking care of myself. So I have a gym routine and ritual that before I show up to coach my clients, I spend the first hour and a half to 2 hours and 45 minutes, depending on the context and what's going on, prepping myself. I fill up. I do my meditation. I do my gym time. I take care of myself so that I can then pour out. And if I don't do that, I'm pouring out of a place of emptiness, which will ultimately lead to burnout. And it could also lead to a place of feeling like imposter syndrome, that you feel so empty inside and you're serving people and maybe it's even working and it's not fulfilling. So part of that integrity is I take care of others by first taking care of myself.
Perfect. The belief that people have that they need to keep pouring out or else the people will disappear, the success will disappear. I can't pour into myself because. What would you walk people through to say that, like, to challenge that belief that they can't be everything everywhere all at once, that they can't take care of themselves, that they're whether or not they define themselves as a people pleaser or just a giver or whatever, or just a great leader? How do you break through a belief that is so strong like that one? That's very common.
Yeah. So when somebody holds a belief, like what you just said, all a belief is a feeling of certainty about how things are. But beliefs are not facts. And how do we know that? Because not everybody believes the same thing. And so first we got to test, all right, so you think that maybe there's not enough of you to go around. I'm too busy to take care of myself. Well, let's look for some counterexamples. Are there any highly fulfilled, highly healthy, highly successful people who are ahead of you on the journey and enjoying the process more, and who do take time to take care of their body, and who do take time to go to a seminar or read a book or fill themselves up? It's not just about taking care of your physical body. It's about, again, self-leadership, pouring into yourself by investing in yourself, by getting a personal trainer. I have a personal trainer. By going to the seminar, by getting the coach, by getting the consultant, by taking the course, by doing the training, by working on your skills. These are all ways of filling yourself up, filling up your gas tank, and equipping yourself, developing that machine to then go and serve. And so when you tell yourself the story, because if it's a belief, it's really just a story. When you tell yourself the story that the problem is time, well, let's test that inside the box. Okay, so you say that the problem is time. Well, how much time do you have? 24 hours a day, 168 hours a week. And all right, so let's test that. Your box versus Elon Musk's box. Is anybody else out there more productive or a more effective, efficient leader than you are with the exact same resource? Yes. Okay, so maybe it's not about the time. But let's say we hold on to that story Brian mentioned before about the identity piece. Sometimes it's scary to consider an alternative because we're worried about, well, what would that mean about me if it's not some out there problem like time? And so we don't want to judge ourselves for thinking that. We also don't want to scare ourselves away from considering it. So let's enter inquiry. And if for anybody in your audience who hasn't heard about Byron Katie, She has a process that's very systematized. She's written multiple books about it. I don't personally use her process very often because it is a little bit slow compared to what you can do in a coaching context, but it's also very effective. It was the first way that I expanded my box. And so it's a series of questions, and all it does is it challenges the belief, which is what we just did. It says, is it really true that I don't have enough time to take care of myself? Or is it really true that if I don't continue to pour out constantly and without rest, that the success will disappear or people will leave me? And some people listening might say, yes, it is true, because it's happened before. I went on vacation and I came back and everybody was gone. Okay, great. So you had a learning opportunity and you told yourself a story about what that meant. And really all that story was is your subconscious's desire to protect you from similar pain in the future. But just because it's a guess, and maybe it even served you at some point, the thinking that got you here might not be the thinking that gets you to where you need to go. And so can we challenge that belief and say, hey, even though this thing happened and I think that means I can't take a vacation or I can't take care of myself, well, what else could it mean? It's another box expanding question. What else could that mean? Could it mean that there was a strategy or a system that I didn't implement before I went on vacation that would have prevented me from experiencing this negative result? How do we test that? Are there any entrepreneurs who go on vacation and don't come back to a building on fire and employees deserting them? So again, we're just inviting ourselves to explore the world outside of this box, and we're testing. I think I gave the example earlier of a math equation. We're testing other math equations to see, hey, could there be other ways of describing reality that might serve better? And that's one of Byron Katie's questions in her process is, who do you become or how do you respond when you think the thought, I can't take care of myself or people will leave me? Well, I burn out. Another way of asking, how's that working for you?
Right.
It's a little bit of a playful way of saying, is it really true that there's not pain associated with your current pattern?
Yeah.
And so the fourth question, though, is where we enter inspiration and transformation. It's, who would I be without that thought? Another way of looking at that is, where were you when you decided, or where were you when you decided that you could never take a break, that there wasn't enough time to go around? Oh, it was when I came back from that vacation. Okay, where were you right before that? It's a weird question. Where were you right before that? Well, I was on vacation. Okay, so there was a time when you had this belief and a time when you didn't have this belief. And when you didn't have this belief, how many more options did you have about how to define the situation? A lot. Lots of infinite options. You just happen to pick one that's not serving you now. So let's go back to that time. Who would I be without that thought? It expands our perception of what's possible, and it allows us to consider alternatives, which expands that box. And now we're able to consider, okay, so maybe it's not that vacation equals everybody leaving me. Maybe it means next time, what's the lesson I can learn from that serves me in the future? Maybe next time I can do things differently. Maybe
Beautiful.
It has nothing to do with vacation. Maybe it has everything to do with systemization and leadership skills, as an example. But those are just some examples of questions.
Yeah.
People can look into Byron Katie if they want more of that. And of course, you can always work with a coach or somebody like that to help you expand that box. But that's an example of how to get yourself through something like that.
I think that's perfect, because it's a good transition too into, now that we've talked about where you are, why you get stuck, what the box is that you're in, and how to start even just slightly expanding it, which is a principle that I talk about a lot with clients who are working on confidence or struggling with confidence just in their body or themselves. It's like, you don't need to smash your box and blow up everything you believed about life and go do crazy stuff to prove that you're confident. It's like, you just need those tiny little expanders, and then it'll open eventually. But if we're at that place where we've expanded the box and now we're in a place of openness and curiosity and, okay, well, what does this mean? Then I go back to that question you said about, how do I maximize likelihood of success? And how can I achieve all these things? And so you've talked about a little bit of servant leadership. You talked about faith briefly, started introducing that concept, and then relationships. So with these three, we'll call them three tools or ways of thinking, how do those things maximize likelihood of success and fulfillment? And how can people start to think about them differently to integrate, which is a favorite word of mine recently with our conversations around it's not this or that. It's not success or failure. It's not, you can integrate it. So how do you use those tools maybe personally or with your clients? And that'll be maybe our last topic, but I think that's very practical, especially because they're areas that everybody has access to.
So for me, when I believed that my family was preventing me from being more successful, that was a very painful way of living. So I was in desperation and I sought to expand that box, and I started asking myself more questions, and I said, well, what if that weren't true? What if my family weren't holding me back? What if the time I spend with my young daughter isn't wasted time or unproductive, purposeless time? What if the time I spend with my daughter are those magical moments that make all of this worth it? And so that's an example of expanding the box. And so I shifted from kind of a victim mindset, honestly, about my family, about my commitments, about what all the things that I was doing, to an abundance mindset of thank you for my daughter, thank you for my wife. Because of my wife and daughter, I have so much more purpose that's worth living for. And so then my tank is full. And instead of doing what I did in business number 6, and just operating from a complete state of emptiness and trying to just crank principles until they worked, instead, I now have a lot of energy. And the quality that I bring, one of the things I didn't mention before about challenging the belief is, well, what if it's not about how much time you spend on these things? What if it's about the quality of time you spend? What if it's about the quality of who you bring, meaning yourself, your state, your energy? And what if you could get, quote unquote, more done in less time, but the more done thing doesn't hit the family piece? What if it's not about getting more done? What if it's about creating more magic so that you fill up their cup, you fill up your cup faster? Think of like an electric car charging for 14 hours versus 1 hour because the charger is a higher quality. It doesn't make the charge more or less valuable, except that it's in less time. And so how can I bring more of me, a better me, to each situation? That's self-leadership, investing in yourself. And so when you have values in conflict, like family versus work, you will always have the tug and pull and push and force of this versus that. Now, that's not something that I can guide your listeners through in 5 minutes, on a podcast. But what I would say is, ultimately, we have to find the higher intent of all of these things. And that's the purpose. So I love my family. I love my work. How can I love them both together in a harmonious, holistic lifestyle that gets me all my outcomes? And maybe I don't have the answer to that yet. And that's okay, because just asking the question with the belief that the answer exists is going to start us moving in that direction. And so maybe you say, I don't have time to take care of my body. I don't have time to spend time with my family. I can't possibly get all the things done at my work. I can't possibly invest in my own leadership skills because the building will burn down if I walk out for 1 second. Okay, great. So maybe that answer is too far outside your current box, and that's okay. So start where you are and move in the direction of where you want it to go. And so what does that look like? Okay, so I'm in this chaos. I'm overwhelmed. There's all this stuff going around. How do I invest in myself? How do I align with my family? How do I align with my faith? It starts by making a decision to raise your standards. And to transition the faith piece in, I think that's one of the greatest gifts that my faith gives me is I believe that because of my faith, I am held to a higher standard. Because it's not just about me. In fact, it's not at all about me. It's really about who put me here and what I'm called to do. And so a lot of times if I'm in a state that's not serving, what snaps me out is, Luke, you got to stop screwing around. You're here for more than this. You know, and so I raise my standard. The same is true for being a Tony Robbins coach. I, to a certain level, represent the brand of Tony Robbins because I kind of wear his name on my shirt. And so it's not about me and what I want to do and what I define myself as. No, I'm here for more than that. And what my faith has given me is the belief that if I have a calling, inherent within that calling is the authority to execute on that calling, which means it's not about, am I good enough? And it's not about, will it work? It's about, I'm there. This is what I'm here to do. What if it doesn't work? We'll figure it out. But what if that doesn't work? We'll keep iterating. So how can I maximize the likelihood of success being that question that we keep asking, and ultimately bringing all of life into alignment so that we don't have this constant tug, but asking those questions to expand the box to where it fits life and self and family and faith and maybe this podcast episode has done that just a little bit for your listeners. And so the call is never give up on investing in yourself, never give up on expanding. You know, we could talk about tactics of time management and things like that. That's out there. If you're curious and you want to find it, Google that. You know,
right?
There's books, there's YouTube, there's all this stuff. But ultimately, scaling doesn't mean doing more. And I think sometimes entrepreneurs here take care of your body as add another chunk of things to your list.
Yep.
And what if it's not a zero-sum game about how much fits in my calendar? What if it's a puzzle that is predestined to fit together when I expand my frame, my box, to fit that puzzle? And what if this is a beautiful journey that I don't have to have it all figured out right away, but I'm aligned with purpose? And so ultimately, scaling doesn't mean doing more. It means setting up your business and your life so that you can have more, be more, become more of what matters. And I think it comes back to that word that you said before, it's expansion. And so if you find that you're overwhelmed, the overwhelm only exists within a certain box. It's time to expand the box.
Amen. Very well said. That's fantastic. And I think that
Marinate on that.
expanding the box for people is also defining what the box is. And that might be your capacity. Oh, I don't have the time to work out. Well, how much time do you think that you need? Well, I need an hour. It's like, okay, well, how much time are you giving yourself currently? Well, I'm not giving myself any time. It's like, okay, well, expanding the box might be 10 minutes.
Yeah.
15 minutes, 30 minutes. Maybe 30 minutes is doable, right? And then the piece that I would give others to consider is, you know, Jordan Peterson talks about, well, you set an aim and it's probably the wrong aim. And that's okay, right? It's probably the wrong thing, right? And it's probably going to be a mistake, and that's okay because you move forward.
Yes.
So I think as a tie down for everyone to this conversation, it's building awareness, expanding through questions or expanding through clarity, testing, is this something I can sustain or something that I can do or something that's going to serve me or whatever that question is. And then from there, you might find that there's so much more that you can continue to expand to. But Luke, this has been fantastic. We want to be mindful of our time that you've given us. Where can people either connect with you or if they love this conversation, they're interested in maybe inquiring about your services, where's the best way to actually discover more about you and have that conversation?
Hey, welcome to connect on LinkedIn. So just look up my name on LinkedIn, and I have Tony Robbins on my profile. I'm the only one of me in the company. So you can look for me there and you can connect and however, if they're in your audience, my hallucination is that they're people that I would love to serve. And so regardless of whether that would be a formal coaching engagement or just connecting and saying, hi, saw you on the podcast, I have this situation, whatever the case might be. I think it'd be great to connect. It sounds like you serve some really cool people.
Awesome.
Love it.
Good stuff. And we'll make sure we put Luke's information in the caption below. And he's been very generous to offer a 30-minute session with himself for free if you want to just chat with him or ask him, like he said, some challenges that you've been stuck with that you want some feedback on. He's given us that link as well. So Luke, thank you very much for being here. And my only quick fire question for you, because we are at time, is what is your ideal day? What do you love? What is your paradise? A 10 out of 10 day for Luke. What does that entail?
High level chunk. Number 1, take care of me, fill up. Number 2, pour out in service to others. And then number 3, spend time with my family.
Amen. I love it.
Great to hear the other side of what you talked about at the beginning was the big challenge and the constraint. That's awesome. Good stuff.
Excellent. Awesome. Well,
Cool.
thank you all for being here. Thank you for allowing us to be in your ear and in your corner today. We hope that there's an insight, a takeaway, something that's inspired you to continue to push forward and expand yourself. Now take this all and go out and conquer your day.
Cheers.
Cheers.